I think it started with learning that my own neighborhood in Providence, Rhode Island, was once a vibrant Chinatown, being surprised in part because there is almost no sign of that today. I'm Jeffrey U. Warren. I'm the 2023 Innovator in Residence at the Library of Congress. I am virtually reconstructing erased communities of color based communities of color that have been displaced, destroyed, and in many cases forgotten. People across the country also have personal relationships to those histories, might be interested in doing this kind of a virtual reconstruction. I've begun to build out a toolkit, a set of tutorials and guides, videos, showing the process. How did I go about this, and how does my research process work? How does my modeling or my three-dimensional reconstruction work? And how can other people do that on their own? Tutorials are broken down into a few phases. One of them is the research guide. In that, I talk about how to go through a catalog, how to search for things. The second one is the modeling guide. So that's actually constructing virtual buildings and scenes. In the atmosphere guide, I'm working with an artist named Alicia Renee Ball to create a feeling of a place. So through different colored lighting, atmospheric effects, fog, or snow piling up on a roof. The last guide is about sound, and in that guide I'm working with an artist named Ann Chen. She thinks about what things did sound like, what it might have sounded like, and composes soundscapes. I would hope that this kind of process and this approach to the work would allow us as Asian American researchers of these histories to find something that is comforting or that is healing by getting past that and trying to understand better what was going on in these communities, what are the stories, what are some of the truths that we can discover or we can uncover. It's not just about the history, it's about ourselves, our future, the communities we are building today. I'm Jeffrey U. Warren, Innovator in Residence at the Library of Congress, and I'm going to show you how to use lighting, textures, and effects like fog to create an emotional tone in the scenes you create.
Atmosphere. If you've gone through the earlier parts of this guide, you may have a 3D model of a building or a part of a neighborhood. But in your modeling program, you might feel that the scene lacks something, that it doesn't jump out at you like a memory or a real place you could imagine yourself within. In this part of the Relational Reconstruction Toolkit, we'll be focusing on creating emotional space through lighting, weather, textures, and even movement. For this part of the guide, I've worked with Alicia Renee Ball, a multidisciplinary artist and designer, to explore how to create a sense of place and space through dynamic world building for our reconstruction models. The kinds of atmospheric effects we'll show help to create evocative moments, like in our strongest memories, the quiet of a snowstorm or the feeling of a rainy day. Lighting is the first and maybe easiest way you can give your scene some emotional tone. Think about sunrise or sunset, or other times of day which stand out in your memory, maybe an especially hot day, or even a snowstorm. Simple lighting effects can be added in the Mozilla Hub's editor, Spoke, like point lighting for lamps or light bulbs, or ambient light or sunlight. You can even animate falling snow, using a component called a particle emitter. We'll talk about this a little later. But to create more complex kinds of atmospheric effects, you'll need to use a rendering program. I used Blender, which is free and open source. For me, it's been a challenge to represent these spaces, because I've found few photographs of interiors, and even fewer of the people who lived and work here. It doesn't make sense to fill these buildings with fictional people, but neither has it felt right for them to be empty. One way I've sought to give a sense of people's presence has been to evoke a sense of warmth and comfort. Wet streets, rain and fog contrast with warm indoor lights to create a sense of shelter and enclosure. And visitors have remarked that they felt physically warmer upon coming inside out of the virtual rain. I was inspired by Alicia Renee Ball's 3D design work because of her powerful use of color, texture, and composition, in addition to her interest in history, identity, and place. Next, she'll show some of the ways she's incorporated more advanced atmospheric effects into a scene in Blender.
Hi, my name is Alicia, and I'm going to demonstrate how I used Blender to world build digital environments. I've chosen to use a 3D model that I created through a technique known as photogrammetry for this portion of the guide. If you would like to know more about this technique for making 3D models, please see the notes written in our guide. This model is a reconstruction of a big timber log cabin found at the historic site New Echota. Before forced removal by the U.S. government, New Echota was the capital of the Cherokee Nation in the early 19th century in the state of Georgia. This area of Georgia is the home of the Coasati, Miccosukee, Yuchi, and Cherokee indigenous peoples. I've been studying the histories of Black people who lived under enslavement in this area, and who later would be known as the Cherokee freedmen following the Civil War. Their stories are a part of the complex history of this place, and this cabin shares some similarities with what their homes may have looked like. For me, this provides a partial glimpse of how they might have lived during this era, and is a part of my journey to learn more about their lives. As you see from my model, it is already skinned with a texture from the photogrammetry process. Then I'm going to create a landscape for the log cabin to sit upon by adding a plane and using it as our ground. I wanted to add depth and dimension to the ground plane instead of leaving it flat. This will help us to create a dynamic sense of place that mimics the variety of landscapes found in the natural world. As I created height and depth on my surface plane, I made sure to examine it from all directions, tweaking it until it felt and looked just right. Next, to bring to life the digital environment I am building, I will be adding in a sky dome to naturally light up our scene. Although it was midday, clear, and sunny when I first visited New Echota to capture the footage of the log cabin for my reconstruction model, I wanted to create an environment that would evoke more emotion and a sublime sense of mystery. To do that, I decided to set my scene at sunset. Now I will pick a texture material that will best represent from memory the texture of the ground at the historical site. I am utilizing texture maps from a subscription-based service called Polygon. For your world-building exploration, you can find free textures and HDRIs to use through a simple web search. From this point on, I will be world-building through what I describe as the speculative imagine. How can I reimagine and rebuild parts of a real place that will evoke more emotion and a deeper connection to its histories? For me, as an experimental artist and designer, I do this through playing with mood. To help me build a more expansive world, I will experiment with mood building through lighting, color, and movement. To do this, I have imported additional models into the scene to better flesh out the environment. The 3D models I'm currently using, I have downloaded from Polygon. Again, for your world building reconstructions, you can find a plethora of free CAD resources online. Pick the models that will best speak to the world you are building and reconstructing. So as you can see, I imported a few tree stumps, a chopped log, and a living tree. These items are in dialogue with one another, showcasing the various stages of life, death, and transition through the use of natural resources to sustain a modern world. From living trees to chopped tree stumps in transition to a log cabin. Creating a narrative or working poetically in the digital environments you build also adds to the dynamism and emotion of place and space. To create more spatial depth in the scene, I have imported a horizontal image of barren trees with a transparent background to serve as our backdrop. This imagery of barren trees creates a sense of coldness in our built digital environment because it reminds us of the transition between seasons, from summer to fall and from winter to spring. Now I want to explore how the use of moving light particles can add an ethereal, dreamly, and otherworldly aspect to our environment. I will explore this concept through creating an animation of sauntering fireflies that will dance, float, and flutter throughout the scene. We will create these dancing fireflies through the use of a particle system in Blender. We will use our ground plane as the source that will generate the tiny orbs of light, and then we will animate it through the use of a physics system called voids. Particle emitters can also be used to create rain or snow in a scene. If you want to know more about how to create a particle system like we did in Blender, please see the notes in our written guide. We decided to use the void system to simulate the flight and the flutter of the fireflies, whose blooming light will add further ambience to the scene. The void system generates a natural flight trajectory for our fireflies. Finally, to turn up the drama, mood, and mystery in this scene, we will also explore importing atmospheric fog into our environment. Now, I will tweak the settings to increase the density, depth, visibility, and color of the fog to create varying moods for our speculative scene of New Echota. In my art practice, I enjoy infusing cosmic drama into the worlds that I build, and I do this mostly through overlaying and merging of colors. This creates a hazy environment of floating auras that coat our sky and changes the dynamic of the scene, depending on the density level of the fog. Here's the end result of my speculative play, and another way you can create emotional space in the world-building development of your relational reconstructions. Thank you.
That wraps up this tutorial. For more information, you can see the written guide online. I'm Jeffrey Warren, 2023 Innovator in Residence at the Library of Congress, and I'm going to show a little bit about the process of modeling buildings from historical records. In my work virtually reconstructing Providence Chinatown, I've shared videos like this one, which is the first moment I had enough buildings rebuilt that it really felt like a neighborhood. The process of creating a model like this is involved, but the basic steps aren't so hard and are similar for each building. This part of the Relational Reconstruction Guide will focus on how to begin 3D modeling using archival records. Let's look at some of the techniques I've used. But keep in mind, the best way to learn is together, and I'll be hosting workshops on these techniques in the spring and summer of 2023. We'll cover tracing building footprints, creating surfaces from photos, and applying those to the model. Often, as shown in the research portion of the guide, I use maps to understand a space at a moment in time. If you have a map showing buildings you're interested in, and you have a pretty flat area like Providence's Chinatown, you can import the map into a 3D program to begin modeling on it. But first you'll need to get the scale right. Many maps, including Sanborn insurance maps at the Library of Congress, have a scale reference. If you don't have such a scale reference, you could try measuring a big building in the real world, or you could try measuring streets. But think about how streets may have widened or narrowed over the years, and how sidewalks and curbs change. Some neighborhoods aren't on flat ground, of course.
I won't go in-depth on terrain here, but if your site is on a hillside, or for example a river valley, you can approximate the terrain by tracing contours and then draping a surface over them. More rural Chinatowns and ethnic enclaves were sometimes on steep ground, which is harder to build on and less accessible, but this also enabled them to be more protected and enclosed. Once you have your map scaled and oriented, you can trace the footprints of buildings on its surface and pull them up from the map to create a very rough model of the neighborhood. If you know building heights, you can adjust those as well. Repeat this for as many buildings as you can. Now, although things are probably strange colors, you have a very rough idea of how different buildings were organized in 3D space. Now I'll show how we can take old photographs like these and map them onto the buildings we've made. I collected these over many months, but now I feel like I have enough to work on this building. For more on finding images, see the research portion of this guide. If you have a variety of photos of a building, many of them partial, it can help to diagram the building surfaces out. We choose as front-facing a photo as we can at the highest resolution available and trace the edge of the building surface. Now I'll use the Free Transform tool or the Perspective Distort tool to flatten the facade as if we were facing it straight on. You may need to combine multiple photos to get a complete facade. Sometimes, if a building has a lot of repeated elements, like windows, it can be worthwhile to use one high-resolution photo to stitch together a much higher-resolution image of the whole facade. This can start to become more speculative, however, if there are details like the staircases and balconies in this example photo, where you aren't completely sure of the original appearance. But it's helpful to keep careful note of what you're basing on a clear photograph versus what you're speculating about. Now, if you have forms ready to apply the facades to, you can do so. Did the building have a gabled roof? Did it have insets or overhangs or columns? At a certain point, you may want to look for free-to-use textures to supplement your model. These could be cropped from old photos from the period or taken from texture libraries with free-to-use images. Now you can repeat the last step with other facades if you have them. I did a lot of image stitching to get a clearer picture of the front of this building. But you don't have to do this. For other buildings, I intentionally left the newsprint texture to show where the image came from. This is a powerful step for me, where we start to get a feeling for the neighborhood through its textures and visual language. Sometimes we can see people walking down the street or paused on a sidewalk. It's at this point that I sometimes feel I'm crafting a space for someone, smoothing out the kinks in the sidewalks, leaving space for gardens or private nooks, sweeping and tidying up their space which has long sat gathering dust. At this point, you may want to begin making your buildings into separate groups within the model. It will help you organize your work and will be more difficult to do later. Flipping or mirroring a photo can help you complete an incomplete facade. It can be hard to know how tall to make a building, but you can use reference photos to estimate those heights in comparison to nearby buildings. Try comparing different angles to photographs of the place to see if you can see things match up. Once your buildings are in place, there are likely still a lot of surfaces in your model which remain bare, and it may help to add textures to things like yards, alleys, and sidewalks. You could also add vegetation or things like benches, streetlights, crates, or other things which help to flesh out the scene a bit. You don't need to model the whole city. Sometimes even a couple buildings can be enough to create a compelling feeling of a place. In a later section, I'll show how lighting and atmospheric effects, as well as materials and textures,
can help to create emotional tone. It's worthwhile to try this even with a partial model to get a better feeling for the space, for example, at night. Above all, I've tried to focus on the feeling of a particular place or moment, rather than trying to create a complete or highly detailed model. Where might residents of this place have sat and watched people walk by, taken a nap, or sat back and daydreamed? That wraps up this tutorial. For more information, you can see the written guide online. I'm Jeffrey U. Warren, Innovator in Residence at the Library of Congress, and I'm going to show you the research portion of the Relational Reconstruction Toolkit. So in this portion of the guide, I walk through the process of finding images, but also interpreting them and trying to piece together what each one shows and how they relate to each other.
Part 1, Research. This is a guide to finding and gathering clues to places which have been erased. Neighborhoods and communities who were not included in archives during their time, and whose traces we can find mostly through the in-between glimpses, the cracks and gaps, the unsaid and the hidden away. Most of what we find through this process is not the real story. It's the selective forgetting, overwriting, and reshaping of histories, despite which we will try to see people, their spaces, and the things they cared about. It's the first part of an evolving guide to relational reconstruction, a set of practices for creating an immersive, virtual, or 3D reconstruction of an erased neighborhood, such as the one I've begun to craft in the Seeing Providence Chinatown project, about the neighborhood which existed on Empire Street in Providence, Rhode Island, until December 1914. This project and the relational reconstruction methodology I envision is focused on memory, remembrance, and personal relationships to histories. It's not a work of history or formal archiving, but a way for us to reckon with the past and its meanings to us today and in the future in personal terms. Think of this as a journey through these materials which you can chart with love, perhaps guiding your community around the hazards and pitfalls of the archival lens, to be close with, to share space with, histories and spaces which we often must glimpse through the cracks. It's a meditation, the searching, handling these artifacts with tenderness, not picking them apart like meat from a bone or gems from the soil, gathering them together with gentle hands, healing yourself as you glimpse them, giving them recognition and rest. A note of caution. To those beginning to look through these histories, please take care of yourself. In this work, you'll come across material which will be painful to read, including violence, but also the diminution of violence, even from present-day historians and archivists. There will be people who don't understand this pain, or how they can add to it. Take breaks and deep breaths. Listen to something calming. The kind of justice we seek in relational reconstruction is through remembrance and connection. It may be someone else's important work to hold themselves accountable for these acts. It may even be yours on another occasion. But our goal here and now is to see beyond those painful parts, to try to connect with people's lives, people who might be your ancestors or who walked a path your ancestors would later. Searching for images. First, if you can, visit the place as it is today. It might be a virtual visit, or maybe a visit through scenes in a movie set in the place. For some places, I visited using Google Street View. Online image search. Searching for Providence Chinatown won't bring up many photos of what the neighborhood used to look like. Some show the area after Chinatown was destroyed. Many of the glimpses we can find of the neighborhood are incidental, in the background of photographs of other things. Looking in the background is how I would describe my approach for many of the images I was able to find of Providence's Chinatown. See how in this image, the same building to the left side, which on careful inspection has an awning labeled Oriental Restaurant, appears again in a second image from the Rhode Island State Archives, again in the background of a photograph of Central Baptist Church, with ladders leaning against it. I used Google and DuckDuckGo to image search by keyword, and these search terms can work for online archives as well. You can begin to develop a list of search terms to work from. Mine included some of the following. The last few are of small streets and alleys that no longer exist. These search terms can also work in the Library of Congress's various search systems, such as the Prints and Photos Division Search. You may have to skim through hundreds of photos. Sanborn maps were created by the Sanborn Insurance Company every few years for most cities since the late 1800s. These can provide detailed context for photographs and other records, as well as addresses, details on entryways, and even staircases or roofing. I use the website cinematreasures.org, which includes a detailed user-contributed history of stage theaters, from construction dates to name changes to photographs, and even dating images based on the posters of shows currently playing. I looked at the Photos and Comments tabs of a page to see user contributions. So many pictures I found had no people in them, and those that did were often hard to place. Some were posed portraits or had blurry backgrounds. As you sift through these photos, keep in mind our goal, to try to understand the neighborhood as it would have wanted to be remembered, not as a museum artifact or a long-ago fable. I asked myself, what would people here have wanted for me as an Asian American living in 2023? Regular events and celebrations nearby can be useful search terms. Examples that helped in Providence, Chinatown, include Chinese New Year, while in Deadwood, South Dakota, Chinese Americans participated in town parades and competitions like the Hub and Hub race on July 4th, 1888, and are featured in several photographs of the event. Newspapers were, for me, the heaviest part of the research process. Due to the constant use of racist language, the casual lack of respect or care for Asian Americans, and the accounts of police harassment, violence, and erasure which pervades coverage. But there was a lot of information in these archives, and I felt a responsibility to sift through them to find what I could. This sometimes meant searching every article of every issue of a newspaper for days or weeks following a major event. I've been very interested in how early Chinese American and Asian American newspapers covered lives of people in their own communities, and have found a number of resources for in-community newspapers, which you can find in the bibliography. Personal, family, and community collections are, of course, the most likely to include items which can give us insight into the lives of people in otherwise erased historic communities of color. But they often exist as the result of careful private stewardship for generations, and families whose histories have been systematically excluded and erased from official white institutions' collections, or whose histories have been represented in racist ways, may be very cautious about how their stories and collections are shared and to whom. Tracking images. In researching Providence's Chinatown, I found that I quickly collected dozens and eventually hundreds of photos, as well as web pages and archives I needed to follow up on. Tracking where each one came from, which I wanted to return to for a more detailed look, quickly became a challenge. This is a spreadsheet I used to organize my record keeping. You don't have to use my system, but I'll share how it works and why. First, it's a working document, not a formal bibliography. In it, I note buildings by construction or destruction dates, addresses, and include notes and links. Using these tracking spreadsheets can surface important connections. Using names from newspaper articles, court records, and other sources, I've been able to reconstruct a rough directory of who lived or worked at each address in Providence's Chinatown. But be aware, these records are incredibly fragmentary and partial, and relying primarily on these kinds of accounts, with their racist views and understandings,
risks giving those perspectives too much control over the way we understand these histories, especially when they are our own. Saidiya Hartman has written about the limits of the archive as a resource for knowledge of the lives of enslaved people during the transatlantic slave trade, and the possibilities of what she terms critical fabulation in overcoming these limits. Jamel Boui writes about the limitations of ledgers and numerically based analysis based in the bureaucracy of enslavement, and what it cannot tell us. Find more information and links in the Inspirations page of the written guide. Mapping photos. As you collect more and more photos, you'll need to keep track of what each photograph represents spatially. Placing them onto a map can be a powerful means of organizing what you know and don't know. Can you locate the buildings in a photo on the map? I copy-pasted or dragged images into a Google presentation like this. As you find more images, you can start to see which buildings you haven't been able to see in a photograph, and how good a photo source you have for each building. Over time, this map will grow as you gain a richer understanding of the way these images fit together to give you a sense of the neighborhood. That wraps up this tutorial. For more information, you can see the written guide online. I'm Jeffrey Warren, Innovator in Residence at the Library of Congress, and I'm going to show you how to use sound in your relational reconstruction model. Part 4, Sound. For this part of the guide, I worked with artist and friend Ann Chen. So far, we focused on gathering, editing, and reconstructing these spaces using visual imagery from archives, personal sources, or the internet.
Adding sound to your reconstruction can be a powerful method to augment a visitor's experience of your space and also reconnect with memories and histories.
At a basic level, the ambient sounds of a neighborhood help to create a sense of being there, from the noise of traffic, to the blowing of the wind, to the sounds of people talking, doing things, and spending time together.
Searching for high-quality sound recordings from our past can often be more difficult than searching for historic images or films. Introducing sounds into your environment and composing a soundscape can be challenging when so little material exists.
A solution we've come up with is to take a speculative approach to sound design. When the audio recordings you need do not exist, how do we rely on other sources, memory, texts, descriptions, visuals, oral histories, to recreate the soundscape of a place in the past? In this section, we will introduce some exercises, suggestions, and tips on how to listen, record, and stitch together sounds to add to your environment.
If sounds from the neighborhood or place you are creating are not easily accessible or available, we can start with other historical sources and ephemera. For this example, we will use a photograph from the Library of Congress of a fish market in San Francisco's Chinatown. Take a few minutes to study this photograph. Write down every detail you can see in the image. Try to be as descriptive as possible. What are they doing? What are they wearing? Now try to imagine the types of sounds that are associated with these details. In this photograph, we can see a young man in a wide-brimmed hat holding a basket, looking down at a piece of fish on the table. The fishmonger standing next to him is looking at him in mid-chop. It looks like they're in the middle of a conversation. What sorts of sounds can you imagine hearing in a fish market? Are any of these sounds something you can recreate yourself? Could you try chopping a fish or rattling a metal bucket on a wooden floor? Are there keywords that you can use to find these sounds in public archives, like this recording of chickens? Let's focus on other clues in this photo. It's on a street. What does a busy street sound like in a shopping district? Do we know what languages are spoken in this neighborhood? Can we go out to record these specific sounds? Once you've gathered a list of sound descriptions, now comes the fun part. Let's go sound gathering. If visiting the site you are reconstructing is possible, we recommend going there and listening to the present-day sounds, even if they've changed. Try visiting at different times of the day, different times of the week, and even if you can, different times of the year.
For this example, I visited the site of Burrell Street Chinatown in Providence and recorded some environmental sounds. This is a clip of what it sounds like today.
So Jeff, how was it for you visiting the site as it is today? What kind of thoughts were running through your head?
I think one thing I noticed because I live in the neighborhood is the constant hum. I guess it must come from all the different heaters and air conditioners and things. And on top of that, you know, Empire Street, it's a pretty big street now, so almost no matter when you go, there will be some traffic, and it's not moving very slowly. But I did notice there were some birds, you know, there were some small trees. Surprising, even, you know, in the middle of March, it's pretty cold, and you know, I can hear myself breathing in this cold air. And there's some kind of like motor going over by the big building over there. So then I was thinking, you know, well, the road, it's much bigger. It's a asphalt road. And then I thought, you know, would there be a road nearby that's closer to what it would have been like? So next I went over just a couple blocks towards the jewelry district, and I stopped when I heard a lot more birds. I mean, there's some bushes, small trees, some vines, and they were really making a lot of fuss. And there was a dog bark. There was, just signs of more like residential life.
From this kind of deep, careful listening, both at the site as it is today and through close attention to images from the period we're interested in, we can collect a range of different sounds which, together, can create an immersive soundscape for our reconstructed space.
Spatialized sound in Mozilla hubs. After you collect sounds, you can place them within a reconstructed scene. Much of the reconstruction work so far in Seeing Lost Enclaves has been in the virtual online platform called Mozilla Hubs. We used Mozilla Hubs to host not only 3D models and visual media, but embedded sounds located within the virtual environment. These sound files are spatialized, meaning that they are louder the closer you are to them. If you wear stereo headphones, you can hear a sound to your left side or right. This allows us to localize sounds in creative ways. For example, in the reconstruction of Providence's Chinatown in 1914, I hid different sounds around the scene, such as the sound of rain hitting the street. I placed these sounds outdoors or behind walls, and when you went inside, they seemed to get quieter. In reality, they were just placed away from buildings, but the effect was such that visitors felt sheltered from the rain once they stepped indoors. Whether we're composing a single sound file as the soundtrack of a video, or placing different recordings around a 3D scene, all the sounds combine to create a sense of place. Now let's put it all together and see how it sounds. That wraps up this tutorial. For more information, you can see the written guide online.
Okay, and so with that, it's my honor to represent the 2023-2024 Innovator in Residence, Jeffrey Warren. He is an artist, an educator, whose artistic practice investigates how people build identity and strength through their interactions and artifacts and histories, and the ways that objects can tell stories that people can be part of in the present. So if you're attending this and you've had the privilege of collaborating with Jeff in the past, or learning from him or experiencing his work, you'll know then that he exemplifies care. Care as an artist, care in all things, but especially in his practice, caring for the stories of Asian Americans today and those that came before. Teaching workshops on the possibilities of what someone can do with a single photograph of an ancestor. Learning how to build a hanok by hand or recreate his mother's memory of a snowy day in Seoul. I encourage you to check out his Instagram account at Unterbahn for a portfolio of examples of his larger memory craft. This is just a piece of a lot of the things that he's doing with his prolific practice. So in this particular case of relational reconstruction of lost enclaves, like the one you're going to see today, this is a project that is about caring and the extreme careful work that it takes to spend hours and hours as a Korean American, as an artist, looking through white-centered archives for news clippings, for business listings, for the corner of a building at the edge of a photograph to illustrate a once vibrant Chinatown like the one from Providence where Jeff currently lives. So to persist and piece these parts of an archive together and then give them back to a community as an embodied experience of care goes beyond and sometimes in spite of what an archive can do. So we're honored to support artists like Jeffrey in this work to reimagine how the library can connect to all Americans, and so honored that you guys could be with us here to experience his work. So now it's a pleasure to hand it over to Innovator in Residence, Jeffrey Warren.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I'm going to share my screen, and that means I won't be able to see folks' comments, but we'll be circling back during the Q&A portion. So let me know if anything comes up more immediately than that. All right. I wanted to share a little bit about myself and how I got into this project to start with. It, in a sense, started way back in 2018 when I was walking around where I live in Providence and came across a plaque from a project at Brown, the Rhode Island Chinese History Project by Angela Fang, Julianne Fontana, John Eng Wong, and Bob Lee and others. They had really done a huge amount of archival research into Providence's Chinatown, which I learned right there existed in the neighborhood and really on the block that I live on. And it's, it was a surprise to me, as it is to many people, that there was a Chinatown there. And they were able to find just these 3 pictures of what it had looked like. A couple of them on the right side, not very good fidelity, hard to really make out too much what we're seeing. But even the 3rd bigger picture, I really felt challenged to know what I was even looking at, like what direction I was facing, anything like that. And so I really began to get drawn into this history through these photos. And I began to be kind of super interested in finding more pictures. One of the very first things that I did as I was starting to get into this work was to take that picture, and I eventually did figure out what direction it was looking. And I just did this really crude Photoshop to just try to see what it would have looked like, overlaid onto a street today. And as, months and even years went on, I started to really deeply familiarize myself with all the little details and features of this neighborhood, both before and after it was destroyed in 1914. And to start to pick out, like, the front of this billboard is the back of that billboard, or this,
this interestingly shaped window matches that one, to sort of place these images both historically, but also in my own mind. And I began to, be able to sort of picture the buildings in the neighborhood as I walked around these blocks today. And I began to wonder, if there were enough photos to create a kind of a model, to be able to experience sort of walking down the street. And I was really intensely curious, not only what it had looked like, but what it might have felt like to be there. And I kind of did this quick proof of concept. And I was encouraged, and I began really collecting images more rigorously, tracing where each photo was taken, what year it was from, and just trying to get as much information about this this little neighborhood as possible. And began to get other glimpses of these streets and these buildings, and very occasionally of people. And along the way, I was very privileged to meet John Engwang, who was one of the original team that worked on this and has been a scholar of this community and its histories for decades. And we share a love of going to archives and finding things and learning more of these histories. And also Irene Luke Hope on the right, who is the archivist of Beneficent Church, and who has herself done a huge amount of work in preserving community history through old records in this area as a descendant of Providence's Chinese American community and of Chinatown. So it's been a really powerful journey, and I began, really finding a lot of photos, including some from the Providence Journal and other newspapers, and approaching what I felt like was a relatively complete collection of all the different buildings in the neighborhood, and piecing them together into a model in a process that I began to call relational reconstruction. And I've made it a goal to try to provide a space of connection with these histories, not so much like a diorama or a trip to a fascinating place, but really more, knowing what it's like to be Asian American on these streets today, more of an interest in knowing more deeply a little bit of what it might have been like for a member of this community, which began so many of the stories we're part of today. That meant that although much of the imagery I found was very disturbing and racist, the job I've set for myself was to try to reconnect with these histories as Asian Americans, and to do so experientially and even creatively. But yeah, I'm going to switch over to this model, and bear with me for a moment. Make sure the sound is on. Can you all hear that?
Not yet.
Oh, let me press that other button that we found. How's that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Glad we found that button. Okay. Welcome. We're going to be visiting a moment in the history of Providence from between 1904 to 1914, when this part of Providence was an enclave and to some degree a safe space for the earliest Asian American community in Rhode Island, Providence's second Chinatown. In this video, we'll be visiting this space virtually through this reconstruction of the neighborhood, which I've crafted. And I'll be addressing primarily Asian American visitors in my narration because we are the primary audience for this work. The challenge in reconnecting to this place is partly in how we each relate to this community. Of course, we want to avoid a sense of tourism, of exoticism, and we also know that these histories have many layered meanings to all Asian Americans and Asian diaspora who live in the area today.
And those meetings aren't all focused on the displacement and discrimination that occurred. As Asian Americans, we have as much or more to learn from the warmer moments. In this visit, remember that connection or reconnection doesn't always happen through words or images. I'll be sharing about the history we know, but try to make some time for your other senses as well and for your imagination. The doors we find in our own memories and family histories are more powerful than those we find in the archives. Mozilla Hubs is a multi-person environment, and that's the environment that I've built this model in. And although attendees will be viewing through my eyes, as you can see, rather than navigating the space yourselves, a few collaborators and previous workshop participants have joined within the space today and will be accompanying us for the visit. You may see them within the environment as bird avatars. That's what you'll see, or that's what's going on if you see birds in the space. Thanks to Jasmine, John, and Aiden for joining us in this way. Let me see, I actually don't see them around right now, but I think they'll be with us. Okay, so first, I'd like to ask you to take a deep breath and to listen to the sounds of the street. Think about the sounds that might have been the same 120 years ago. Let's travel back to 1914. You're near the site of Providence's Empire Street Chinatown, walking up Westminster Street towards the edge of downtown. It's raining gently and the streets are empty. Ahead is the intersection with Empire Street, across from the familiar entrance to the Empire Theater. Turning the corner, the street is far smaller than it is in 2023, and it's a mix of dirt and round stones under your feet. The curb is taller, the sidewalks narrower than Providence today. You glance over your shoulder, but it seems like you're alone as you look ahead and see the Onlyong Merchants Association building ahead in the gloom. You exhale. The distant sound of a trolley clangs as you approach the warm glow of the grocery store front you know so well. You think of the owner, Mr. Kwong, who you can picture looking up to smile at you as you enter, a bell jingling as the door swings open. Mr. Tao has brought in freshly grown radishes from his farm just outside of town, much better than the bedraggled ones that come in from Boston. Next door, you can smell the food wafting out from the doorway, maybe the smell of crisping hot oil or simmering soup, the murmur of voices. Around back, the narrow alley opens onto the kitchen, but you don't go in because you've already eaten and you know they won't let you go without a hot bowl of, what is it? You picture the dish in your mind, its aromas bringing you back to a childhood memory. You duck back out into the rain for a moment to cross over to the looming 3-story building where the Onlyong headquarters is. You pass through a shop crowded with shelves of homewares and dry goods. You climb briskly up the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor, where your room overlooks the street. Slipping off your shoes, you approach the window. You can hear a neighbor plucking a string instrument, and down on the street below, you see a cat jump gingerly down from the wall next to the pharmacy, picking its way between puddles. You close your curtain and get ready for bed. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we saw during the visit, but outside of the immersive context of Chinatown. For starters, the Empire Theater, which you see here, was in the model. It's the street. It's what Empire Street was named for, and it was torn down the same year, 1914, as Chinatown. This is a view of the street today from where the entrance to the Empire Theater would have been. And folks who know Providence might recognize the Providence Public Library in the distance, as well as where AS220 Community Art Space is about halfway down the block. Here's the same angle in the model in the environment that you were just in. And you can see there's a kind of a collage quality of the photos that make up the buildings. Some of them are, a few of them are contemporary photos, but most of them are from a mix of different time periods. And I want to know, I mentioned this is the sort of the second Providence Chinatown. In some ways, it's a continuation of the first, which was on Burrell Street, about a half block behind us from this view. Each of the buildings was made up of real images of the neighborhood, but some of them, the fidelity of the images was so poor that I occasionally would do this kind of stitching together of pieces to make up a facade. So in this case, this is the Onlyong Merchants Association building, where I had a really good picture of the side of the building, but not of the front. And so I was able to use pieces of the side to kind of rebuild the front in order to bring it to life a little bit more crisply. And you may have noticed a number of the buildings, like the grocery, pharmacy, and restaurant that we went into first, had a halftone pattern. And that's because those buildings are only visible in photographs published in the newspaper, the Providence Journal. So in a lot of cases, I left the halftone pattern there, partly to show the kind of erasure that's represented visually in the environment. But also I felt that the texturing, it didn't really significantly prevent us from experiencing it as a space. And so I was sort of selective in which buildings I chose to bring to a higher resolution. Another thing that's true is that there's very few pictures of people. I think that's because the photographers were mostly white and didn't have a relationship with, or at least not a good relationship with, members of the community. There are some portraits and family photos that Irene Luke Hope has stewarded at the Beneficent Archives. But for the most part, these are the kinds of glimpses we might get of the interiors. And some of these pictures inspired the narration that you heard, like the scenes from a kitchen or a restaurant. These were probably on Burrell Street, half a block away, these photographs from the Providence Journal. And one thing that I noticed a lot was not only do we have very few interior photos, but it's very rare to see a view of the neighborhood from the inside of a building. And I think that gets at that bias in the archival, views, the sort of photographer's gaze, the white gaze of the documentation we have. And by making a model of this kind, we are able to kind of try to reverse that and to get these very special views looking out from a bedroom window or an office window onto the street, which is something I really appreciate about this process. I also wanted to mention a few ongoing collaborations that have been part of this work, one with Dree Chu Tattersfield, who I've been working on a model of the Portland Chinese vegetable gardens. And Dree and I also did this collaboration very recently to produce a paper zine of the neighborhood where we also tried to represent that same view out a window. And we try to draw the reader in interactively into the scene. And it's hard to represent this in photos here, but we'll be announcing this zine pretty shortly. And it has really a full paper model of the neighborhood that you can really kind of get into and experience in a way more tactily and more narratively. So yeah, look out for that on my Instagram, hopefully in the next week. I also really have used creative means to get into the stories and to provide kind of an alternative to just a historic or archival view. And I draw the neighborhood a lot, and I try to understand it through drawing. And I also have a kind of a long-term goal of writing a picture book about the neighborhood and really centering more narrative approaches to happenings in the neighborhood. I've storyboarded out parts of this. So someday, hopefully. I also wanted to note that after many, many months of design and planning and collaboration with collaborators Vic and Vuti, we recently did a community memory event on the site of Providence's Chinatown, where it was designed around the kind of feeling of a street food environment, where we served hot food from the Chin families, Charlie Chin and Chanel Chin, who are descendants of Providence's Chinatown, from their restaurant Asia Grill in Lincoln. And we had people join us and experience not only kind of seeing archival photos and doing activities in relation to them, but also we created a VR experience. And rather than using VR headsets as they are, we crafted a set of masks. Here you can see there's an ox, a dragon, and a tiger mask, within which are VR cardboard headsets. So these participants are immersed in a scene from the Burl Street Chinatown, and we incorporated audio, oral history, and narration as well on site. And that was really special. I wanted to also mention that I have already been hosting a lot of workshops to invite people, especially Asian American folks, to participate and to try their own relational reconstructions based in either archival photographs of folks or ways of connecting with your ancestry, or family photographs. And this is an example of one that I made using a photo of a child during the Korean War reading some comic books on a fence. And this is one of the earliest ones I made, and you can see how it's a much more collaged, rougher process, but the idea is to sort of extend the textures out of the original image to make a kind of an environment that I can immerse myself within, to sort of feel that I'm there with this kid. And that kind of practice is something I'll be hosting a lot more workshops on. I've been calling it Ancestral Memory Enclaves, and it's sort of the very first step in a deeper relational reconstruction methodology or process. And these workshops will make up part of the toolkit, which we're announcing today. And there will be a link that you can learn more about this, and there are some online guides and videos and documentation to invite, members of the public to do relational reconstruction. And that's it for my comments. I did want to quickly thank the Rhode Island Chinese History Project that I mentioned in the very first slide. Organizations like AS220, the Providence Public Library, Movement Education Outdoors, the City of Providence's Arts, Culture, and Tourism Department, descendants of Providence's Chinatown who I've been able to work with in this project, and other organizations who have been helping and supporting this work. And of course, the Library of Congress and the Innovator in Residence program. And I also just wanted to shout out and thank my collaborators, Vic, Vuti, Dri, who you saw in the earlier slides, but also Alicia Renee Ball, Ann Chen, Aidan Choi, and others. And finally, to folks like Linda Sue Park and Sadia Hartman, who have really theorized and prototyped these powerful ideas of speculative history and critical fabulation, in the case of Sadia Hartman, in the face of partial and sometimes traumatic archival history. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think we're going to go to some Q&A. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. We've had a couple so far. Oh, I think I have an echo. Thanks. So there's just a couple of general questions that we got first to start out before some of the specific questions that are in the chat. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. Text me. Okay, so we will start with the ones in the chat. So the first one we got was from Kari Hervey Lentz, and they are asking what software was used to build the model, and also is there a public version available? And an attendee named Birkin put in a link to Hubs, which is correct, but I didn't know if you wanted to say any more about that to Kari's question.
Sure, and I think, oh yeah, that's the other thing I wanted to do is show the toolkit itself. I forgot to actually, I have that open in a tab. So maybe that's a good opportunity to do that. I'll just share my screen again real quickly. Yeah, so the toolkit, which I mentioned, this is the sort of front page. It has an introductory video, and it really goes very in-depth on, I won't say too in-depth, but it goes very into a lot of detail about the process, not only modeling, but also the research process, the sound, and in some cases I collaborated with other artists to produce some of these. So I'll just briefly show mapping, the mapping process and how maps play a role in the work. There's also the modeling portion, getting at the question, where I actually use SketchUp a lot to produce initial models. It's a very easy to use program, and then I move things into Mozilla Hubs. I'll use Blender a little bit, which is open source and free to use. But there, I do think you can really use the software of your choice, as long as it can produce the file format that Mozilla Hubs will read. But yeah, the documented process I used SketchUp, and then you can sort of see how I use images within there, and then at some point I bring it all into Mozilla Hubs, and then I add lighting and things like that. I will just briefly show a couple shots from, there's a chapter or a section in this toolkit on atmosphere, and I worked with Alicia Renee Ball, who's an amazing artist, and Alicia shows really step-by-step how she has used Blender and a lot of the lighting tools and sort of environmental techniques like fog and all kinds of stuff to create emotional tone and depth in the models, and that's been a big inspiration for me in my work. And then also there's a section which I did in collaboration with Ann Chen, an artist who works a lot in historical soundscapes and crafting of historical soundscapes. So that the steps go step by step through not only the process of kind of a deep listening in photos, but also kind of reconstructing the sounds that might have been in those photos, and then also embedding those images, or sorry, those sounds within Mozilla hubs to create the kind of spatialized sound that you heard during our visit.
And there was a question from Kari, just to follow up, about whether the relational reconstruction environment hubs that you showed is publicly available.
Yeah. The environments will be, I think, quite shortly. We're trying to figure out the best way to share them. I think they are actually online already, but yeah, very shortly we will. And the other thing is we'll have videos of something very close to the visit that you just had, as well as one to the Portland Chinese vegetable gardens that I did in collaboration with Drichu Tattersfield. And for updates and when those are posted, you can follow us at the experiments page that has been linked a couple times, as well as I'll be sharing it out on my Instagram as well.
So there's some questions in the chat and some questions in Q&A. We're going to jump over to Q&A for a bit. So first one is from an anonymous participant. How did you make decisions about interior spaces, such as floor plan, and whether or not to furnish them?
Thank you. Yeah, you may have noticed that a lot of the interiors in the model are relatively empty. And I've taken different approaches to this over time. I think the first thing that I thought about was, because there are so few pictures of interiors, the interiors would be much more speculative than the exteriors. The exteriors, I think, are relatively true in size and texture and things to how they were. And so I have been more careful about the interiors. I also felt that apart from just the furnishings, it was challenging to think of a respectful way to represent people without actual photos of the people who would have been in there. I mean, the few photos we have are mostly either kind of a bit out of context, like they're grainy, like the newspaper ones, or they're seated portraits, and so that would be a little tough to kind of weave into an interior scene that would feel kind of normal and not posed. So there are challenges like that. I tried to represent the presence of people through the warmth of the spaces, through lighting, kind of referring, getting at some of the work I've done with Alicia. And then finally, I've also hosted workshops where I've invited mostly Asian American workshop participants to look to their own family histories that may have parallels or connection to these histories, in order to speculatively imagine what the interiors were like. And we have had workshops where people, I remember one person grew up working in a family restaurant and reconstructing the inside of the restaurant as a speculative interior that felt, true to the spirit of the space, even if it, wasn't based on a photograph of that specific interior. Or someone else who created an environment around an altar scene from a family photo of themselves at the age of, I think, 11 or 12, with their aunt at an ancestral altar. And then it turns out there's actually a photograph of an altar from Providence's Chinatown in an old newspaper, one of the very few photos we have of an interior. And it was really interesting to see the reconstructed memory enclave from the workshop alongside this historic photo of an altar, and see the commonalities. So yeah, I've been taking different approaches to it, but I think that's another thing that I hope to go more deeply into in the coming year. Jamie, would you like me to just scroll down the comments and pick one out, or I'm also
if you want to. Sahar and I were just talking and saying maybe we should go through the Q&As first. I think that might be easier because we've selected those, and then we can move to the chat. And you are muted.
Good, I get to try again. All right, I just opened up the Q&A. Thank you. So Dr. Shao from the Library of Congress's Asian Division asked about what cities will be kind of like in the plan, I think, coming up in the coming year. So I mentioned briefly Portland's Chinese Vegetable Gardens, which is, I think, a really interesting one that Dri Chu Tattersfield has led and I've been collaborating on. And that's an interesting one because it's technically within the limits of the city of Portland, but it really is almost a rural scene. It's a farm that is in what is now West Portland. That's one that you will be able to see very shortly as we share some videos and documentation around. But I also am looking forward to visiting a few other sites. I'm interested in places like Riverside, California, where there was both Chinatown and also an early Korean American community called Pachapa Camp in, I want to say, around 1907 or 1908, if I remember right. And places like Terrace in Utah, where folks have, been remembering histories of a whole town that's now gone, but there are still artifacts and places sort of to the northwest of Great Salt Lake, I think. So places like that I'm interested in. And I've also been collecting and trying to organize just a huge amount of photographs and records from the Library of Congress. And I've been organizing them by region. And that's shared in, it's linked to from the research portion of the guide that we looked at. Yeah, and thank you for the question. I see another person asked about the politics from that time period and whether World War I was, the politics, sort of the current, I guess, the current events may have overshadowed the destruction of Providence Chinatown, or and asking about if people were compensated or hurt during the process. It's an interesting question. I have often seen headlines about World War I alongside headlines about Chinatown in the Providence Journal. And so, one thing was newspapers were like really big back then. I mean, physically large. The broadsheet size or whatever, I don't know my newspaper sizes, but it had like 8 columns. So I guess there was just room for a lot of news. I mean, it was really, so I don't feel necessarily that it was because of World War II, but I think that the coverage that existed in the Providence Journal and other local papers was very tilted. It was biased, and it was often racist in the way that it covered happenings in the neighborhood. It described Chinatown very often as a criminal place or a place that needed to be, needed law enforcement or something like that. So that made it, I think, very challenging to get a real sense of what the community was like and not be influenced by those views. As to whether people were compensated or hurt, I want to say almost certainly not compensated. I've never heard any record of it. There was newspaper coverage of landowners in that area being compensated, but since Chinese Americans were on the whole not landowners, and I think I've never heard of folks owning land in Empire Street Chinatown, and in fact during some periods it may have been prohibited on the basis of race. Yeah, I don't think there was any compensation. As to whether people were hurt, I know that the community was able to kind of reconstitute in a new space about a mile away, west over what is now the highway, although it didn't exist at that time, and continued there for some decades. I don't know that many of the individual stories of how people made that transition, but I can't imagine it was easy. And I hope that kind of addresses the next question about erasure and what happened to the community after 1914. There are quite a number of people who remember what people will call the Summer Street or Werner's Lane Chinatown, which is what I mentioned, where the community moved across. I will say that also there was on Empire Street a Black American community that was also displaced at the same time. And in the new building where folks from Empire Street Chinatown moved to, that had previously been a Black community, and they were displaced in a kind of a chain reaction. So there was a lot of people displaced at this time, and I think there were all kinds of harms related to that. So yeah, a lot of this stuff I've learned from John Engwang, from Irene Luke Hope, who has herself childhood memories of seeing the Summer Street Chinatown, and other descendants in the area. And I think that's the main way that we learn about, today we can learn about that time period. But most of the memories that people have date back to around the 50s, not all the way into the teens, of course. That's all the questions I see highlighted. I can switch over into the comments. I see Holly has a question. Did you find a lot of information and photos on food or restaurant related items? From my experience, Asian American culture is centered around culinary identities. I think that's totally true. It's nice, there are menus in the Rhode Island State Archives, so you can see some of the things that are served there. One contrast I think is kind of interesting is I recently was at both Asia Grill and at Chen's up in Woonsocket, which is a historic, both of them are historic Chinese American restaurants. Chen's dating back, gosh, into the 40s or earlier, I think even earlier. I don't have my Chen's history quite right, but interestingly, both menus have, I think it's called like an American food section. I think Asia Grill has only one item on that in that section. And that's interesting to me because when I spoke with Irene Luke Hope about her memories growing up working in Luke's, the famous, locally famous Chinese restaurant downtown, she said they had two separate kitchens, one for Chinese food and one for American food, as they described it at the time. American Chinese food, and kind of meant that they would have, two different cuisines. And what they called American food was sort of steaks and things, I guess, white American food, and then Chinese American food was served from the other kitchen. And there was really two full menus at that time. And sort of see today's menus that still have kind of a little hint of that left over is kind of interesting. But yeah, we would see also advertisements in the newspapers. And I know Erin Castillo, another person who's been really researching early Chinese American history and food history in particular, has found a lot of ads. And Erin found one ad that informed the narrative you heard today, which is that on Empire Street was a restaurant called Yick's in, I think it was earlier on, like I want to say 1905 or maybe even earlier, at that address where I mentioned in the narration hearing sort of cooking sounds and things. And that's what inspired that part of it. Thank you for the question.
I'm going to pass this to Jeff because one of these got skipped. Someone put in, can you talk about the erasure? So what happened to this community after 1914 and how did you come across it?
Thanks for unmuting me. I see. I think I actually tried to address that in talking about the Werner Street Chinatown, which is where folks moved to after Empire Street Chinatown was torn down. So, and I mean, I could speak a little more on how I learned about it. It's documented to some degree in the Providence Journal. I learned a lot from John Engwang, who has studied the histories of Providence's Chinatowns for a long time. and just in terms of, what I was mentioning about descendants with memories of the Summer Street Chinatown or Werner's Lane Chinatown, that's where I've learned the most about what that Chinatown was like, although a little bit further forward in the 50s.
Do you want me to, sorry, you have it. Okay.
Sorry, maybe I can just scroll ahead a little bit and pick out a few pictures here, or questions here. Is there a reason why it's rainy and dark in the rendering? Yeah, I have made a daytime rendering, and I also like it. I think I have a dream of someday making a blizzard or a snow day rendering. But the weather and the lighting, for me, are part of developing a sense of place and an emotional connection with places. So I try to think of them as warm, inviting places that it's nice to get inside out of the rain. And in some of the visits that I have hosted where people have gone into the neighborhood in Mozilla hubs, folks have even said that they felt like warmer stepping off the street into a building because of some of the atmospheric effects. But yeah, it's not the only way that I represent the neighborhood. It's just one that I happen to like and I think is a pretty evocative one. But it's a very good question. The Portland Chinese vegetable gardens model is a daytime model, and it comes with a lot of challenges because you can see further. You have to fill a lot more space. It's also it's not a narrow alley, that particular community, and so you have to model a lot more. And yeah, and in that model, I was telling Jamie earlier, we've tried to put in something like 20,000 plants, which is its own whole project, and it creates some chaos in the model. But if you're going to model a farm on a hillside surrounded by a forest, then you have to dig into it quite a bit. And yeah, it's we're relying a lot on, I think, essentially video game technologies here, and luckily they're up to probably a lot more than I'm pushing the envelope in the models that I've made. Although occasionally it will sort of skip and have trouble with things if I add like too many lights or something like that. But yeah, thank you. Let me see. I see people are pointing out there are a lot of other interesting places where there are Chinatowns, and yeah, it's been. Maybe I can link to the page where I compiled up. Well, I'll see if I can pull that later. But yeah, there's a big spreadsheet where I have compiled a lot of resources from the Library of Congress about different Chinatowns around the U.S. and as well as some resources outside the Library of Congress. And yeah, I'm always interested to learn about new places where there have been not just Chinatowns, but other early Asian American communities and other communities of color that it would be interesting to do this work in. Yeah, and I'll say also, oh yeah, I see someone mentions the Marie Rose Wong book on Portland's Chinatown, which is a big source for Dree and my work there. I would say, yeah, one thing that's an important part of my process is if I'm working in a new place, I'm really seeking to develop a partnership with people who either live there today or who have a personal connection to that place. So sometimes, perhaps a descendant of a community that's no longer there, or someone who, like in the case of Dree True Tattersfield, Dree went to, I think, high school in Portland and Dree's high school was on the site of the Portland Chinese Vegetable Gardens. So that was a big surprise to Dree and was one of the inspirations for choosing that site. So yeah, if there are folks who have that kind of relationship personally to a space, please do reach out, and I'd love to figure out ways to collaborate or to support a project to do reconstruction there. I'm going to switch back to Q&A because I see There's a few more in there. Oh, great. Question from Dai Gao. Thank you. And how do I see this work influencing current placekeeping and placemaking efforts in living Chinatowns? That's such a great question. Thank you. Well, first, I mean, not just in living Chinatowns, but like in Providence, we have so many communities which are experiencing displacement today that are, communities of color. And so I see what we learn about Providence's Chinatown and the sort of environment and circumstances historically, socially, culturally, and politically around that as very much about today's displacements. And so, I hope that by doing this work and engaging in it, we learn about the ways we want to be in the present. But yeah, I have a lot of admiration for a lot of the hard work that goes on in present day Chinatowns as well to continue and preserve them. And I'll mention inspirations I've had. Wing on Woe Project has done incredible work in preserving oral histories and working with elders and engaging in creative practices. Many others as well. I think there's a project Siagi in the Bay Area that's doing work with Korean American elders and stories. So there's just so many projects which I've been very inspired by in my work, and I aspire to collaborate with in the future, I hope. Because I think that, that's why this has to be a creative a project that is not just historical, but is also creative, because these have to be living histories and we have to be engaging them in ways that aren't just writing everything down sort of in a sense before it's gone, but we have to be making new meanings from them and deciding how we want to live in the future based on what we can learn from these histories. And I see Mia Cariello, I hope I didn't mispronounce that. What, if any, hiccups or bumps did you encounter while trying to craft the project's script, particularly using or being inspired by Hartman's critical fabulation? Yeah, it's a very good question. So you may have noticed that I stopped at one point and I didn't fill in the blank on what exactly was the food that you might have recognized. Because it's actually less that it is true that I don't know that all of us could call to mind the smells of a particular dish, especially from that era's, American Chinese foods, or what we may not know what was served in a restaurant that catered primarily to residents of Chinatown, as opposed to ones where we have English language menus in, say, the Rhode Island Historical Society. But the other part of that is that I really want not just to speculate, but to invite visitors, and especially Asian American visitors, to participate in that speculation and in that critical fabulation. So that was a challenge, in part because I think inspired by collaborating with Drew Tattersfield, I've been incorporating more narrative, more interactivity into the work, but pushing it beyond just, what do you hear, what do you see, but to really anchor that experience in a very specific memory in the listener's mind. And that's tapping into a connection to history and to ancestry that's going to be different in different people's minds, and is something that I can't even necessarily evoke specifically for someone. So that was, I think, a really interesting challenge, and I hope an interesting moment in the narration. But yeah, I mean, in general, I can only aspire to do work that is, as deep and thoughtful as Saidiya Hartman's, and I'm, constantly looking to her example and her as an inspiration. So thank you for the question. Were there other questions that, Jamie, you wanted to highlight, or Sahar? Oh, one more in the Q&A.
Yeah, there's one more in the Q&A.
Oh, sorry.
And there was one in the chat as well.
Great. Anonymous participant asks, in terms of the built environment, has this ongoing research and creating the various models helped you to see major similarities or major differences among Chinatowns? Yeah. One thing is people sometimes note that the buildings of Providence's Chinatown aren't architecturally recognizable as a Chinatown. And I mean, I have different feelings about that. And to me, in a sense, it doesn't matter. I mean, like, these are the buildings as they were. They were, we can guess that they were precious and familiar and important, no matter how they looked, and that's what the streets looked like. So I think that's one way to understand it. Another is, I think there's a complicated history of how different Chinatowns that have created kind of architectural interventions have done so to renegotiate their place in a broader city, to present themselves as a destination, a tourist destination in some cases. And there's some pretty interesting histories you can read about some of the big Chinatowns and how that was approached. And in many cases, it was done at a time where it was in order to prevent violence against these communities, to sort of choose to be seen as a destination rather than as a target, in a sense. So that's part of it. And then there are many other history. I mean, it didn't happen the same way in all different places. And so I think, yeah, it's an interesting thing to dig into, like how that's worked in different places. But in Providence's Chinatown, for the most part, there weren't that many sort of architectural changes to buildings. And that's also related to the fact that in Providence, nobody owned the buildings, as far as I know, as I mentioned. And so they didn't have the permission to make those big changes. Whereas in bigger Chinatowns, and also a little bit later in history, more often, folks did own buildings or were legally allowed to own buildings by a certain date. And then we're able to make those sort of big changes and to shape the neighborhood at an architectural scale or at an urban planning scale. And some of the biggest, most famous Chinatowns, I think there's a good section on it in the book On Gold Mountain by Lisa C. For LA's Chinatown, where there were big urban planning projects that were organized by the communities in Chinatowns to sort of reshape the community for different reasons. But thank you for the question. And then I see. Thank you, Sahar, for bumping one up. Can you say a little bit more about the maps that you used and how you related photographs and maps? I showed a couple glimpses of this. I use a kind of, you may have seen it like in K-dramas or something, or just like thrillers where there's like just a big map with a lot of pictures pinned onto it and strings. So I have done that in real life, but mostly I'm doing that within Google Presentations or some online software where I import a map, and I'll use most often a Sanborn insurance map, which the Library of Congress has a very comprehensive collection of. Those show each building's outline and things like the steps or sometimes materials they were made of, or roofing. And then I'll overlay all the images I have in thumbnails, and then I'll try to figure out, I'll draw a line to where I think the photo was taken or what it represents. So that's sort of my process. And then at some point when I begin modeling, I'll actually literally trace the outline of the footprint of the building, and I'll kind of extrude it up and use that as the basis for the model. And you can see that in animated GIFs and in video in the modeling portion of the guide. Thank you. I see Julie Chen has asked, as someone who's originally from New York City, I'd love to find out where if where I live now once had a Chinatown that no longer exists, Rochester, New York, for example, how would you recommend that I start? It's a interesting and tough question. I think when I started in Providence, I had that website, Rhode-IslandChineseHistory.com, RIChineseHistory.com, to start with. But then I just started web searching, Providence, Chinatown. Today, a lot of pictures that you'll find are actually pictures that I've made or I've found on my websites. But at the time, you would find a few from, news articles or blogs where people had done prior research and surfaced some of these pictures. But I think pretty quickly, in a lot of places, you'll hit a dead end or you won't find much. I had a similar question. I grew up, or when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time. I grew up for several years in New Haven, Connecticut, and I've wondered. I still to this day don't know. Was there a Chinatown in New Haven? And going on, Google or DuckDuckGo image search hasn't brought any images up that seem to answer that question. So I think my next step in that case, if I wanted to dig deeper, would be to go to some local libraries and archives and begin to look at material that hasn't been digitized, or perhaps that is not showing up in a general web image search, but maybe you can search just the digital. You can search for images within a specific library or archives website. You can also search the Library of Congress. So I think those are a bunch of places you can start. And there is more on that process in the research portion of the guide that we've linked to. Thank you. Yeah, you really have to get creative and look at a lot of sources. So I think but it's a very good question. And if you're interested, I'm also happy to connect with you to I don't know if that's Julie Chen that I know. Maybe that's a different Julie Chen, but in either case, I'd be happy to connect with you and try to take those first few steps. Yeah. Oh, hey, Julie. Thank you. Are there any others? I can reopen Q&A again. I don't see anything in there. And one other Saidiya Hartman, just to get at the question someone asked about, which was the Saidiya Hartman piece that I mentioned. Another one that's really incredible that gets at specifically critical fabulation and speculative work around partial and traumatic archives is Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which I'm currently in the middle of. Sorry, just typing that in there. And it's incredible. So I strongly recommend that one too. All right. Well, thank you all so much for all your questions. I really appreciate them. And yeah, I hope to hear from you all again.
Truckee, California, Chinatown, circa 1870. In 1870, more than a quarter of the population of Truckee was Chinese American, and a bustling Chinatown included 11 groceries, as well as tea shops, doctors' offices, gardens, and a bathhouse. Truckee's Chinatowns were subject to racist treatment and were burnt down repeatedly until 1886, when most Chinese Americans left. Some relocated to Oroville and other areas, where they found relative safety and prosperity. Today, descendants of the Feng Li family business in Truckee continue to trace their history back over 140 generations, and still remember their years in Truckee and the home they were able to make there.
Riverside, California, Pachapa Camp, circa 1912. In 1908, Pachapa Camp was established in Riverside, California during the beginning of the occupation of Korea by the Empire of Japan, and played a role in independence organizing by early Korean Americans. Families built a small community and earned money by picking citrus. Photos of residents include children playing baseball on track, riding bicycles, learning trumpet, and playing among the chrysanthemums the community grew. Hanford, California, China Alley, circa 1892. The Taoist temple is still stewarded by descendants of the neighborhood called China Alley in Hanford, California. As artist Evelyn Yin writes,
the town of Hanford was formed in 1877 when the Southern Pacific Railroad extended into California's San Joaquin Valley. Many Chinese laborers came to work on the tracks and later stayed for farming. They were mostly from Samyup, the three former counties of Lam Hoi, Puen Yu, and Shundup in Canton, now known as Guangdong Province. China Alley prospered to include restaurants, homes, boarding houses, general merchandise stores, herb shops, gambling establishments, a Chinese school, and a temple. Over 100 years later, the brick buildings remain largely intact and unaltered.
Providence, Rhode Island, Empire Street, Chinatown, 1910. Providence had a vibrant Chinese American neighborhood on both Burrell Street and Empire Street.
between 1880 and 1914, but successive displacements pushed the community out of downtown by 1914. Some in the community were escaping racist violence across the West Coast, including Tao Fu, who moved from Portland and grew heritage vegetables on a plot outside of town. The community included musicians, chefs, pharmacists, and members of a local church choir. Tucked into small private alleys were a tea shop, several groceries, and a restaurant called Yick's. Portland, Oregon, Chinese Vegetable Gardens, circa 1901. On the west side of Portland, at the present site of the Multnomah Athletic Club and Lincoln High School, a small farming village sat along the banks of the Tanner Creek from the 1870s through the early 1900s. Today it is covered by many feet of infill, but by 1900, dozens of small buildings clustered on the hill overlooking the creek, where you could see crops growing in lush fields on the steep hillsides, and clothes hung out to dry.